Mr. President, it now falls to you to be both former Republican Senator George Aiken and the man to whom you spoke, Lyndon Johnson. You must declare victory and get out. You should survey the dismal array of options in front of you. Even the orders given out last night, sort them into the unacceptable, into the unsuccessful, and the merely unpalatable, and then put your arm down on the table and wipe the entire assortment of them off your desk, off this nation's desk, and into the proverbial scrap heap of history. Unless you are utterly convinced, willing to bet American lives on it, that the military understands the clock is running, and that the check is not blank, and the Pentagon will go to sleep when you tell it to, even though the Pentagon is a bunch of perpetually 12-year-old boys desperate to stay up as late as possible by any means necessary. Unless you're sure of all of that, get out now. We are at present fighting in no particular order the Taliban, a series of sleazy political/military adventures, not the least of whom in this mountain rain collection fixer Karzai, and what National Security Advisor Johns estimated in October was around 8 dozen Al-Qaeda in the neighborhood. But poll after poll and anecdote after anecdote of the reality of public option inside Afghanistan is that its residents believe we're fighting Afghanistan, that we, sir, have become an occupying force. Yes, if we leave Afghanistan, certainly we'll have an occupying force one way or the other, whether it's from Pakistan or consisting of foreign fighters who will try to ally themselves with the Taliban. Can you prevent that? Can you convince the Afghans that you can prevent that? Can you convince Americans that it is the only way to undo Bush and Cheney policy catastrophes dating back to Cheney's days as Secretary of Defense in the 90s? If not, Mr. President, that way lies Vietnam. If you like Iraq, you will love Afghanistan, with 35,000 more troops complete with the new wrinkle straight from the wind mind-blinder lingo of Joseph Heller's Catch-22. President Obama will be presenting an exit strategy for Afghanistan. The exit strategy that begins by entering still further, lose to win, sink to swim, escalate to disengage. And even this disconnect of fundamental logic to predicate on the assumption that once the extra troops go in, when the president says, okay generals, time for Adult Swim, time to get out of the poll and bring the troops with you, that the Pentagon is just going to say, yeppers. The Pentagon, often to our eternal relief, but just as often, sadly, to our eternal regret, is in the war business. You were right, Mr. President, to slow the process down once a series of exit strategies have been offered to you by men whose power and in some cases livelihoods are predicated on making sure all exit strategies everywhere forever don't really result in any servicemen or women actually exiting. These men are still in the belly of what President Eisenhower so rightly, so prophetically christened the military-industrial complex. Now and later, as the civilian gray eminences with retired next to their names, formally lobbying the House and the Senate, informally lobbying the nation through television and the printed word to engage here or serve there or invest everywhere, they are, in many cases, just glorified hardware salesmen. It was political and operational brilliance, sir, to retain Mr. Bush's last Secretary of Defense, Mr. Gates. It was transitional and bipartisan insight, sir, to maintain General Stanley McChrystal as a key leader in the field. And it was a subtle but powerful reminder to the authoritarian-minded war hawks like John McCain and the blithering idiots like former Governor Palin of the civilian authority of the Constitution. It was a picture drawn in crayon for the easy of digesting by the right to tell our employees at the Pentagon to take their loaded options and go away and come back with some real ones. You reminded them, Mr. President, that Mr. Gates works for the people of the United States of America, not the other way around. You reminded them, Mr. President, that General McChrystal is our employee, not our dictator. You've reminded them, Mr. President, now tonight, remind yourself. Stanley McChrystal, General McChrystal, has doubtless surveyed this country bravely and honorably and at great risk. But to date, his lasting legacy will be as the great facilitator of the obscenity that was transmuting the greatest symbol of this nation's true patriotism, of its actual willingness to sacrifice, into a distorted, circus, funhouse mirror version of such selflessness. Friendly fire killed Pat Tillman. Mr. McChrystal killed the truth about Pat Tillman. And that willingness to stand the truth on its head on behalf of selling a war, or the generic idea of America being at war to turn a dead hero into a meaningless recruiter poster, should ring essentially relevant right now. from the very center of the part of our nation that could lie to the public, could lie to his mother about what really happened to Pat Tillman, from the very man who was at the operational center of that plan, comes the entire series of plans to help us supposedly find a way out of Afghanistan? We are supposed to believe General McChrystal isn't lying about Afghanistan? Didn't he blow his credibility by lying so obviously and so painfully about Pat Tillman? Why are we still believing the McChrystals? Their reasons might sound better than the ones that they helped George Bush and Dick Cheney fabricate for Iraq. But surely they are just as transparently obviously off the forest. Half of the men insist we must stay in Afghanistan out of fear of not repeating Iraq, while the other half, believing Bush failed in Iraq by having too few troops, insisting we must stay in Afghanistan out of fear of repeating Iraq. And they are suddenly sounding frighteningly similar to what the Soviet generals were telling the Soviet politicals in the 1980s about Afghanistan. Sure, it's not going well. Sure, we need to get out. We all see that. But first, let's make sure it's stabilized, and then we get out. The Afghans will be impressed by our commitment, and will then take over the cost of policing themselves, even though that cost would be several times their gross national product. Just send in those extra troops, just for a while, just 350,000. I'm sorry, did I say 350,000? I meant 35,000. Must be a cough stain in the paper. Mr. President, last fall you were elected. Not General McChrystal, not Secretary Gates, not another Bushian drone of a politician. You, on the change ticket, on the pitch that all politicians are not created equal. And upon arrival, you were greeted by a 3-mile island of an economy so bad that in the most paranoid recesses of the mind, one could wonder if the Republicans didn't plan it that way, to leave you in the position of having to prove the ultimate negative, that you staved off worldwide financial collapse, that if you had not done what you so swiftly did, that this economic cloudy day would have otherwise been the biblical flood of finance. So much of the change for which you were elected, sir, has thus far been understandably, if not envied, tabled, delayed, made more open-ended. The patient adds, Mr. President, and while the first 1,000 key decisions of your presidency were already made about the economy, the first public, easy-to-discern, mouse or elephant kind of decision becomes public tomorrow night at West Point at 8 o'clock. You know this, Mr. President, we cannot afford this war. Nothing makes less sense to our economy than the cost of supply for 35,000 new troops. Nothing will do more to slow economic recovery. You might as well shoot the revived auto industry or embrace the John Boehner healthcare reform and spray-tan reimbursement system. You know this, Mr. President, we cannot afford this war. Nothing makes less sense to our status in the world than for us to re-up as occupiers of Afghanistan, and for you to look like you were unable to extricate yourself from a military Chinese finger puzzle left for you by Bush and Cheney and the rest of the Halliburton's henchmen. And most of all, and those of us who have watched these first 9 months trust both your judgment and the fact that you know this, Mr. President. Unless you are exactly right, we cannot afford this war. For if all else is even, and everything from the option of the generals to the option of the public is even, we cannot afford to send these troops back into that quagmire for second tours, or thirds, or fourths, or fifths. We cannot afford this ethically, sir. The country has, for 8 shameful years, forgotten its moral compass and its world purpose. Here is your chance to research that there is, in fact, American exceptionalism. We are better. We know when to stop making our troops suffer in order to make our generals happy. You, sir, called for change, for the better way, for the safety of our citizens, including those citizens being wasted in war for the sake of war, for a reasserting for our moral force. And we listened. Now you must listen. You must listen to yourself. Good night, and thanks for watching.
Okay, let's go!
Sick?
You okay?
Yeah.